Yuji Itadori is one of the most polarizing main protagonists in modern shonen anime, but probably not for the reasons you would think of. His character isn't considered to be controversial or awful by any means. The real reason is because of his author, Gege Akutami, and the lack of protagonistic love he chooses to show Yuji throughout Jujutsu Kaisen's runtime. This leads to Itadori being considered a boring and less interesting protagonist in comparison to other popular main shonen protagonists. And because of this outlook on his character, people miss the true meaning behind why Gege portrays Yuji in this specific way. And due to this unique approach Gege takes to his main protagonist, other characters in the show tend to steal the spotlight quite often. Of course, there are numerous shonen anime which feature popular fan favorite characters other than the main character, but none like Jujutsu Kaisen. Yuji oddly takes the backseat for a majority of what is considered to be his story. Whether this is entirely for narrative purposes or simply a stylistic choice by Gege, we'll touch on later. But for now, let's consider this. If you think of Jujutsu Kaisen, I'm sure the first character that comes to your mind is either Gojo or Sukuna, neither of which are the main characters. You see, for any major series, the main protagonist is usually a key part of its identity. Yuji as a character is of course integral to JJK's identity as a series, but on the level of other popular shonen anime protagonists, absolutely not. Now, I'm gonna ask you to think of any other popular shonen anime. Black Clover? Easily Asta. He leaves the strongest and largest mark on the series through his brash and loud personality. What about My Hero Academia? Once again, it would have to be Deku. As opposed to Asta, Deku stands out heavily through his timid but necessary confidence and of course his immense intellect. Another example, Naruto. Again, it would have to be Naruto Uzumaki. He's overly confident and stands out amongst his other cast members thanks to his brash personality. And for our final example, I'll use One Piece, because again, Luffy stands out for most of the series because of how he approaches the people and the world around him. But character traits aside, what do every single one of these characters have in common? They all have a goal that gives the journey they embark on an identity unique to them. Of course, while this may be true for the characters that I just listed, not every shonen protagonist actually has the goal that those guys do. Let's consider someone like Ichigo from Bleach. He doesn't have a specific goal, like becoming the Hokage or Wizard King. Ichigo's motivations are actually rather simple. His true goal in life is to protect the people he loves and keep them out of harm's way. So, then how is that any different from Yuji, who is also lacking a main end goal for his character, but has similar ones to Ichigo throughout the entirety of the series? Well, to establish why this actually is different, let's talk about Yuji's star aligning moment, the moment in the series which puts his character into perspective. While I personally believe that the ending of the JJK manga sees the best of Yuji's character, the most important part for his development is absolutely his final fight with Mahito, which is luckily featured in the anime. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I am of course referring to Itadori's famous I am you moment. But more specifically, I'm actually referring to his speech surrounding the cog metaphor. Itadori within this scene most notably refers to himself as a cog in the wheel. The wheel being life and everything surrounding him, and the cog being a representation of himself, a piece of machinery that reacts to everything else around it. This analogy for his own situation as a sorcerer is the perfect summary of Yuji's character and his role within the narrative. This moment brings about the culmination of every single event that has taken place surrounding Yuji during the Shibuya raid. It most importantly stands as his self-realization moment. I also like to think of this scene as Gege giving the readers a reason for why he hasn't treated Yuji like the standard shonen protagonist up until this point in the narrative. Itadori's speech to Mahito here symbolizes all of his time spent in the story up until that point. Yuji as a character, and genuinely just a member of society, has solely reacted to everything going on around him. He is almost never in pursuit of anything of his own volition. For instance, he does not seek to become a sorcerer, he just does. He does not seek to become Sukuna's vessel, he just does. And a little more ridiculous example, he doesn't choose to become Toto's brother, he kinda just ends up becoming it. In the grand scope of the series, Itadori is just a normal kid being dragged into a world he's unfamiliar with. But here's the thing, Itadori isn't just a normal child, is he? But we're going to touch on that later. My point here is, almost everything Itadori has done in the story is in reaction to the world around him. There is a term for this in media, and it's known as being a passive protagonist. But I wouldn't actually refer to Yuji as a one-to-one passive protagonist. But I would also not refer to Yuji as an active protagonist, one which drives the narrative and causes things to happen. Itadori's character is one about the loss and gain of protagonism, and the acceptance of his own role within the society he resides in. It is a slow, but meaningful journey which demonstrates the wonderful intricacies of JJK's writing, and it is for this reason why he differs from Ichigo and every other shonen protagonist. Itadori is unlike any other protagonist I've engaged with in terms of narrative scope and importance. Yuji stands as a passive and reactionary protagonist simply when it comes to the plot devices, but within the scope of his own character, he is one that highlights the core meaning of an active protagonist. Itadori does not drive the world he is a part of, such as other shonen protagonists, but he does make choices regarding how he exists within it. His character is one that is fighting with itself the entire story. He is teetering on the line of his moral codes and his view on the world around him. And while this highly unique juxtaposition of pacifism and activism create one of the most interesting characters in shonen, it ultimately gets overlooked because of the inherent nature of such a bold narrative choice. Unfortunately, to the casual audience, which is the very large majority of JJK's viewers, this lack of a specific goal and narrative activism to highlight the intricacies of Yuji's overall role within the story doesn't paint him to be that interesting of a character, especially since he's the main protagonist of a series as popular and widespread as JJK. But, like I just explained, this is very much an intentional creative choice by Gege, otherwise Yuji's character would obviously not function this way. But, when writing him to be a main protagonist who inherently is never shown the benefits of actually being the main protagonist in a major shonen anime, is never going to allow him to stand out on his own. This is why numerous other characters are more memorable than the main protagonist in hundreds of thousands of fans' eyes. Yuji is barely given the spotlight in his own series, because that is the nature of how he chooses to function within the Jujutsu world. And for the cherry on top, when he actually is given an ounce of spotlight, it is almost immediately overshadowed by Gege intentionally including another character doing something even crazier. Yuji landing numerous black flashes on Hanami? No one cares anymore because Gojo's here now, and he's firing off his strongest attack possible. Yuji beats Mahito up and gives a dynamic speech which puts into perspective his final realization of what his role among Jujutsu society is. Again, too bad. Kenjaku's here now, and he sweeps the kill and steals the entire show with his cold and menacing demeanor. Itadori goes on a nice little fight win streak with some random grasshopper and Choso, the Choso fight being one of the best in the series? Again, he's knocked out now, and Sukuna becomes the protagonist of the series, getting one of the coolest fights against Maharaga. Gege makes it a point to almost always one-up Yuji in the series of which he is the main protagonist of. And in response to this disrespect, I've seen countless amount of people saying that this is all due to Gege just hating his characters. While this is mainly a joke, and while there are numerous statements out of Gege claiming he just doesn't like someone like Gojo, Yuji's lack of narrative spotlight is an intentional piece of characterization to highlight his approach to interacting with Jujutsu society. However, despite all of these things, I believe the real reason Yuji's character is entirely misunderstood is because of how it suddenly shifts towards the very end of the Jujutsu Kaisen manga. At the very tail end of the Sukuna raid in the manga, Itadori is suddenly morphed into the typical shonen MC. This is the moment where Itadori transitions from a passive/reactionary protagonist to an active one. And mind you, this is all done in the span of a very few chapters. This comes after hundreds of chapters being cursed by Sukuna, simply being forced to remain a cog in the wheel of Jujutsu. Yuji's situation within the story completely flips on what seems to be a dime, and while it may seem odd at first, this sudden flip is actually everything but sudden. It is a moment which has been building for the entire series. The narrative has finally reached the point where Itadori finally decides to become the linchpin. A linchpin offers the opposite role to a cog in Yuji's famous analogy. It is a person who is vital to the operation currently at hand. In simpler terms, it represents an individual who is highly important in driving forward whatever is currently going on. Remember how earlier I mentioned that Yuji wasn't exactly a normal kid? Of course you do. I do too. I mentioned this to keep the thought in the back of your mind. Pretty much every shonen protagonist features a special aspect to their character, and Itadori's would be his status as Sukuna's vessel. However, unlike other characters with inner demons, Yuji is portrayed as a completely normal guy who just happened to eat Sukuna's finger. In the first couple of chapters, Gojo chalks Itadori's ability to contain Sukuna up to him being a phenomenal talent. Of course, this is the actual statement here on screen, but the overall basis is Yuji is a very rare exception that can act as a vessel for cursed objects such as Sukuna's fingers. As I mentioned before, it is common shonen to have the main protagonist of a series have a hyper unique feature such as this. It is what gives them an identity separate from the rest of the cast. But as we know, this uniqueness is quite undersold by Gege for nearly the entire series, as again, a way to highlight Yuji Itadori's role within the wheel. Itadori, despite being labeled as special, is still just like everyone else, because he chooses to be. He doesn't want to be separate from the people around him, and for the majority of the show is in denial of his true purpose. A purpose that inherently separates him from every other person within society. Contrast this to the very end of the series, where it is revealed to us, the readers, that Itadori is in fact Sukuna's nephew. This relationship relation to one another very obviously confirms why Itadori was able to contain Sukuna and why he was so special. But up until this point in the story, that key bit of information being withheld led to why he hasn't necessarily felt all that special. When he isn't landing black flashes at will, his presence as the main character isn't really felt. But as we've already established countless times, this is the core premise of Itadori's character. So why does Gege suddenly perform a giant 180 out of nowhere? While a majority of fans believe it was solely due to a rushed and poorly handled ending, I believe it was a way to establish Yuji's final realization and acceptance of his true role. Throughout the series, Itadori has struggled with his relation to Sukuna and its effects on others surrounding him. This is a very large aspect of his characterization. He wishes to protect people, but is held back from that goal numerous times because of an individual controlling his body. He doesn't want to accept that he is also in some part responsible for Sukuna's actions. But slowly throughout the series, Gege builds upon Itadori's mentality shift. His acknowledgement of Mahito, considering themselves one and the same. His pleading guilty and accepting his role in the Shibuya massacre after being questioned by Higuruma. And finally, his acceptance of Sukuna, fully mentally binding himself to the King of Curses. Itadori's character is so misunderstood by fans because it is one of a slow realization. He doesn't present a goal or a desire. He presents a concept of morality and its effects on a person. His shift at the end of the manga is not one that simply appears out of nowhere. It is him accepting his position as more than a cog. It is the culmination of a long journey, one of mental strife and anguish. Itadori finally accepts his role as Sukuna's vessel, understanding that he is the only person capable of existing with such a curse. And to top all of this off, Yuji also finally receives his long-awaited domain expansion, the pinnacle of Jujutsu. The duration we as readers spend in Yuji's final domain is almost entirely a one-to-one conversation with Sukuna. Itadori, for most of the series, is portrayed as a down-to-earth guy who throws punches first and asks questions later. But at the very end, when he finally accepts who he truly is and what that means, he sits down and has a one-to-one conversation with the man that only caused him anguish and turmoil. He speaks to Sukuna because he understands he is now in control. Yuji showcases his growth and true strength, which comes in forgiveness and acceptance. And this finally completes his transition from a reactionary protagonist to one who drives the plot. This character is awesome. Genuinely, I think the entire build-up of his character and the conclusion he receives is so underappreciated. I can understand if you think the ending was a tad bit rushed, because even I think it could have used 10 or more chapters of different informational bits here and there. But regardless of this, the core moments for Yuji are still in there, and deliver in my opinion. That'll be all for me though. Make sure to comment what you think about Yuji's character down in the comments. Is he truly misunderstood, or does Gege just hate his main protagonist? I'll be looking and responding, so please feel free to speak your mind. I have another iteration of my UFC anime style breakdown video coming next with a different character, so stay on the lookout for that. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. I would really appreciate it, but just know your viewership is perfectly enough for me. With all of that being said, I want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.